The visual is not important here. The music is not important here. The voice is not important here. What matters are the words. If you cannot listen to the words, you do not belong here. If you understand this, welcome to the Fate Club. In the early stages of what can be perceived as a subtle collapse of duality, the pattern first emerges along the lower vibrations of perception, where opposites define themselves through tension and separation, and where the presence of light is acknowledged, but not yet dominant. In these dimensions, close to the boundary of dense consciousness, the clash between opposing forces is almost constant, and the perception of conflict forms the rhythm of existence. This duality is reflected, as esoteric sources indicate, in 3D and 4D layers, where matter and energy interact so that contrast defines value and separation constructs identity. The senses interpret this as a constant struggle. The world arranges itself into binary oppositions: fear and safety, pleasure and pain, loss and gain, dominance and submission. Within this oscillation, the notion of a decisive confrontation begins to form, though it is not yet fully visible, existing as a subtle undercurrent in the flows of energy connecting all entities across space and time. As consciousness evolves into higher frequencies, approaching what is described as 5D, duality still exists, but is softer, more fluid, and less binding. In this layer, the distinctions between opposing forces lose the sharpness of polarity and become interwoven into patterns of resonance and reflection. Here, the duel is not fought as a struggle of violence or ego, but as an intricate dance where awareness of one's own light begins to define the boundaries of the opposing darkness. Yet even at this level, duality is present, visible in the subtle hesitation between what can be called shadow and illumination, between the latent resistance of old structures and the emerging clarity of awareness. At the moment when the collapse of duality reaches its threshold, the great confrontation begins to manifest, not as an event localized in space or time, but as a wave propagating across dimensions, reaching through the layers until it brushes against the perception of those still anchored in lower vibrations. This is the great duel spoken of in esoteric lineages, the confrontation that is not of bodies nor armies, but of currents, of principles, of energy that refuses to remain inert. It penetrates quietly, gradually, first as unease, as a sense that the old polarities no longer hold, and then as clarity that light is the source and the ultimate resolution. As this wave moves, duality in 5D begins to dissolve. Shadows of the old polarity linger, whispering their presence in fleeting resistance, but they no longer possess the structure to oppose light in a lasting way. It is observed that in these moments, entities experience a subtle unbinding of their identities. The old roles, reactions, and attachments that once defined opposition begin to dissolve. This process is not experienced as reward or punishment, but as the natural realignment of systems no longer sustained by the architecture of duality. The great duel has no winner among the separate entities because it transcends separation entirely. The movement of light through forms simply realigns what was divided. Light in this account is not merely illumination. It is source, origin, the unavoidable coherence of being that gathers all strands of existence into a singular resonance. When light reaches the climax of the confrontation, all remnants of duality are drawn into it. Resistance, contrast, shadow, and hesitation are absorbed, not destroyed in the sense of annihilation, but assimilated, as their distinction was only ever possible within the structure of duality. In this process, the dimensional framework that once supported conflict begins to collapse. Even in 5D, where duality still whispers faintly, source light continues to expand, filling every gap, leaving no space for opposition to persist. The encounter is observed across layers as a subtle pulse, a rhythm that moves through the currents of consciousness, penetrating those still anchored to older frameworks. The perception of struggle diminishes, the old binaries lose their gravity, and the narrative of opposition fades. Entities begin to experience moments of clarity where action no longer feels forced by contrast, where decision is not bound by fear or desire, and where presence itself becomes sufficient to sustain reality without the need for conflict. Yet this does not occur all at once. The Great Duel is extended across what can be considered the lifespan of a dimensional collapse, a slow, inevitable crescendo of resolution. This confrontation, in its subtlety, continues to reverberate across lower dimensions where humans still perceive duality in every choice and every reflection. The undercurrent of the great battle is felt as tension that cannot be named, as the sensation that what was once oppositional no longer truly exists. The mind, which once relied on contrast to understand and organize experience, begins to perceive that duality was always a temporary arrangement, a scaffold for consciousness that now is being withdrawn. The pulse of light moves through the hidden places of thought and emotion, guiding the remnants of separation toward unity without instruction or awareness. In the midst of this, light is observed acting as the inevitable harmonizer. It does not strike, nor does it dominate in the sense of coercion. It merely permeates, filling the spaces left by dissolved polarity. The entities that had been defined by conflict begin to experience the absence of that definition, a neutrality that carries both weight and freedom, where choice emerges not from opposition, but from clarity. Even those who remain in 3D and 4D, sensing the wave only faintly, register the change as a quiet recalibration of perception, a slight shift in resonance that cannot be ignored but cannot be fully articulated. The Great Duel, therefore, is both everywhere and nowhere. It is neither a war to be won nor a test to be endured. It is the transition of duality itself into non-duality, the moment when light, as source, draws all distinctions into coherence. Observers across the spectrum of existence may feel its echoes as tension, as fear, as exhilaration, or as quiet recognition that something old is ending. The passage is slow, measured in subtle increments that collectively form an irreversible transformation. By the time the final phase is approached, all structures that allowed duality to persist in 5D are collapsing into alignment with light. Resistance diminishes not because it is annihilated, but because it cannot persist outside the framework of duality. The wave of the great confrontation carries through every layer, folding back upon itself, creating harmonics that resonate across all planes of existence. Even the faintest shadows are gathered in, transformed, and incorporated. The great battle is over, yet its reverberation continues as the final movements of assimilation complete their passage through every thread of consciousness. In these moments, entities perceive the essence of light as a singular, omnipresent source. It is neither object nor subject. It is the foundational principle that organizes, integrates, and dissolves. Duality, once a necessity for experience and comprehension, no longer has the architecture to maintain itself. In the subtle spaces between perception and awareness, the confrontation is witnessed not as conflict, but as reconciliation. The Great Duel has served its purpose, and the presence of light now defines the limits of all that remains. Even as this wave touches the lower perceptions, the remnants of the old polarities appear only as fleeting shadows. The mind, accustomed to opposition, notices the absence more than the presence, a gap that carries the weight of inevitability. Light, as source, does not create new duality, nor does it enforce harmony. It simply exists as the final reference point, and everything once opposed becomes part of its coherence. This is the imprint left by the Great Duel, a subtle yet profound restructuring of all that can be experienced, a quiet confirmation that source is ultimate and inescapable. In the closing stages, the observation of the duel is no longer required. Light has moved through, collecting, harmonizing, and integrating. Duality ceases to exist in its original form, leaving only the remnants of awareness that are now free from contrast. Entities sense the transformation as a quiet expansion of perception, an alignment that no longer demands judgment or decision. The echo of the great confrontation lingers only in the memory of tension, a faint trace that confirms the inevitability of source as the ultimate and singular principle. If you understand this, welcome to the club.